Guten Tag, WAP. This is Mr. Linegar. Let's make history today as we go over Unit 3, Day 12. We're going to talk about Japan during the modern period. Japan will reform very successfully and modernize. But let's get started with our daily punishment. German sausage jokes are just the worst. Key terms for today: Tokugawa Shogunate, Matthew Perry, Meiji Restoration, Zaibatsus, the 1889 Constitution. We're going to go over the weaknesses of the shogunate and the reasons for its fall, the impact of the Meiji Restoration politically, economically, and socially, and Japan's foreign policy at the turn of the century. So Japan is going to expand their empire in the 1800s, but first we need to talk about their reform. So in the late Tokugawa shogunate, they had a central bureaucracy. They combined with alliances to the feudal magnates, the daimyos. The government was chronically short of funds. This will weaken the shogunate and make it vulnerable to external threats. There was an alliance between the bureaucracy and the samurai during this time. Neo-Confucianism became more popular in Japan, and it made life more secular. Literacy rates in Japan were much higher than other parts of the West. The National School of Learning is going to emphasize essential Japanese culture like Shintoism. The Dutch Studies School will represent an attempt to learn Western science and technology. Although, remember that when we talked about the Tokugawa shogunate beforehand, they are afraid of European technology to some extent. They only allowed one ship to trade once a year. They're afraid of things like guns, and some of the technology would destroy the social structure of Japan and would cause everything to become topsy-turvy. What's going to change all this and change the isolationism in Japan is Matthew Perry. He was an American commodore who's going to arrive in Japan in 1853. He's going to demand that Japan be open to trade. The indirect threat he gave them was if they don't do that, like he'll bombard their port. Japan did not adopt Western technology before this time, so they had no way of stopping this. Japan realized that if they wanted to be able to defend themselves, then they're going to have to modernize and industrialize. They also saw the example of China, who was being conquered by Europeans at this time. The shogun and the daimyo both made appeals to the emperor. The emperor will become a powerful figure. In the 1860s, samurai armed with Western weapons are going to defeat the shogun's army. In 1868, certain samurai are going to restore imperial rule under the Meiji emperor. And Meiji was his name. They're going to restore rule under the emperor. Although really, it's going to be the army officers running Japan. The Meiji government is going to abolish feudalism. They're going to create a centralized government. They're going to replace the daimyo states with regional prefectures. They're going to send the samurai abroad to study political economic organization. They're going to create a conscript army since they'll be using rifles. They no longer need to use samurai. In 1884, they create a legislative branch, the House of Peers. They create a civil service examination system to open the bureaucracy to men of talent. Let's talk about the 1889 Constitution. It will recognize the supremacy of the emperor, but it will give limited powers to an elected lower House of Representatives and the House of Peers. Voting rights are going to be determined if you own property. Only 5% of the population could cast ballots. So even though Japan creates a quote-unquote democracy during this time, it's not very democratic. Political parties will develop during this time. There'll be an inclusion of businessmen among the powerful elite, which will be different from the Russian model of reform. Japan will create a business class, unlike Russia, where they rely on a lot of foreigners for investment of their factories. So let's talk about Japan's Industrial Revolution. Japan's Industrial Revolution is going to be heavily based on their army. It's going to be influenced by their army and navy. Many reforms were enacted to reform their armed forces. It was necessary for military reasons. They created an internal infrastructure. Guilds and internal tariffs were abolished. The government will be involved to help out startup factories So the government will help out like companies like Mitsubishi and provide loans for them, like state-sponsored capitalism, crony capitalism. It's going to be different from Russia, like I mentioned before, because in Russia, a lot of the businesses were foreign owned. In Japan, they are creating Japanese factories and Japanese businesses, although the government is supporting them. The government will build model factories to provide experience with new technology. Private enterprise will soon join government initiatives in textiles. There's going to be huge industrial combines, which are called zaibatsus, which are huge factories that usually make a couple of products, which will be used to serve to accumulate capital for major investments. As a result of all of this, Japan's careful management of industrialization is going to limit foreign investment. Japan is going to rely on the importation of raw materials from the West. Remember, you need raw materials in your factories to turn them into finished goods. Japan does not have a lot of raw resources, so they're reliant upon getting those raw resources from Western nations. More than Russia, Japan's industrialization dependent on selling manufactured goods abroad. So they are selling their manufactured goods abroad to make money. Let's talk about some of the societal changes. There's going to be a big population growth in Japan. This will strain the Japanese resources. Patriarchal household will remain the norm. Divorce rates will increase. The new educational system will stress science and loyalty to the emperor. There will be a push for Westernization. Western culture arrives with models of state and industrialization. And Japan will become more aggressive in foreign policy. Japan, late in the game, will enter the race for colonies and imperialism. They'll annex the Ryukyu Islands. They'll win victories over China in the Sino-Japanese War in 1895 and Russia in the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. These wars will yield some new territory to Japan in northern China, Taiwan, Korea. In 1910, Japan will officially annex Korea. Industrialization and a successful imperialism will have its own costs, however. Industrialization is going to upend older traditional social classes. Imperialism is going to demand a strong industrial base, so they need more raw resources. There's going to be a rise of nationalism in Japan. Conservatives were appalled at the trend to imitate Western Europe. Some of these conservative leaders are going to urge loyalty to the emperor and the nation. Japan's going to become very nationalistic, extremely nationalistic during this time, and much more aggressive as far as foreign policy goes. And nationalism will have a huge force in Japanese politics, which you'll see all the way up until World War II. So out of all these nations, Japan was definitely more successful than Ottoman Empire, China, or Russia in industrializing. Japan will successfully industrialize and modernize their society. They don't form a fully functioning democracy, even though they create a democratic government. Only 5% of the population can vote, and like a lot of the military officers have a lot of power there. The emperor does have some power, although he is very symbolic. But they create a very strong modern army, which can be seen in their defeat in Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. All right, guys, that's all for this unit. We are done. We'll be finishing up with our last unit when we get to our next video, 1900 to present. But that's all for this unit. We're all done for 1750 to 1900, done with the modern period. Until next time, deuces, 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 yeah.